In the American Practical Navigator, first published in 1802, and often considered the foundation of modern maritime navigation, Nathaniel Bowditch wrote, "Tropical cyclones are infrequent in comparison with middle and high-altitude storms, but they have a record of destruction far exceeding that of any other type of storm. Because of their fury, and because they are predominantly oceanic, they merit special attention by mariners. The rapidity with which the weather can deteriorate with the approach of the storm, and the violence of the fully developed tropical cyclone are difficult to imagine if they have not been experienced." A well-worn copy of the American Practical Navigator sat in United States Navy Commander George F. Costco's library on the battleship USS New Jersey in December 1944. Serving as the chief aerologist of the Third Fleet, Costco was responsible for weather forecasting, but he was blissfully unaware that the bulk of the United States Naval Strike Force on the Pacific was sailing straight into the heart of a deadly typhoon. I don't know about you, but to me, one of the most fascinating aspects of World War II is the many different strategies both sides employed to try and change the tide of the war. It's fascinating to wonder what would have happened if some of these strategies were even just slightly different. Wouldn't it be cool to test some of these theories out and see what would have happened? Well, now you can. Call of War is a free online PvP strategy game that lets you choose a real country to lead during World War II. You can fight up to 100 other players in real-time games that can last weeks. Use different units, tanks, planes, and other secret weapons to build your army as you declare war on your neighbors and forge alliances with other players. Put your own strategies to the test as you engage in epic battles for control of the world. And now Call of War is offering an exclusive gift for fans of big old boats. Click on the link in the description below to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of a premium subscription for free. This offer is only available for 30 days, so don't miss out. Thank you again to Call of War for supporting the channel. Now back to Typhoon Cobra. By the end of 1944, the United States was well on its way to defeating the Japanese Empire. After a series of blistering losses in the Battle of the Philippine Sea and the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy was in shambles, and their ability to wage war was greatly diminished. In December, the United States was on the offensive, as they island-hopped ever closer to mainland Japan. Their main strike force on the Pacific, Task Force 38, part of the Third Fleet, had grown considerably over the course of the war. By mid-December, it included 7 Essex-class fleet carriers, 6 Independence-class light carriers, 8 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 11 light cruisers, and about 50 destroyers. Focus had shifted to retaking the Philippines, and Admiral William Halsey's carriers, fresh off of a series of resounding victories, were providing air support in preparation for the coming invasion. On December 16th, with many of the ships in Task Force 38 critically low on fuel, the force was joined by 12 fleet oilers, 3 fleet tugs, 5 destroyers, 10 destroyer escorts, and 5 escort carriers, with replacement planes, equipment, and crew to undergo refueling and replenishment operations. Refueling was of course a somewhat routine operation for the task force, and while they were somewhat safe from enemy attacks, the refueling process made many vessels more vulnerable to high seas. This was a particular issue for the numerous destroyers in the fleet, which were notoriously unstable due to their low draft and bulky superstructures, packed with as much firepower and equipment as possible. New radar systems and anti-aircraft firepower that was recently added to many of these ships exacerbated these issues. With almost empty fuel tanks, many of the already unstable destroyers were riding dangerously high in the water, making them all the more unstable. This issue was well known, and in order to compensate for the necessary ballast, fuel tanks were typically filled with seawater. But because the destroyers were preparing to refuel, the seawater had been flushed out. On the morning of December 17, 1944, as refueling operations commenced, the weather quickly began to deteriorate. Despite the worsening conditions, Commander Costco and the other weather forecasters in the 3rd Fleet had no idea what lay only a few hundred miles away. The increasingly heavy seas made refueling virtually impossible, and as the day went on, things only got worse. The first signs of trouble were noted on the evening of December 16th by a PBM-3 Mariner flying boat that observed a storm system with winds exceeding 65 nautical miles per hour during a weather scouting mission about 250 miles southeast of Task Force 38. They relayed their observations to an Army Air Force weather forecasting station on Saipan. Another seaplane observed the same weather formation a few hours later and reported a typhoon warning that was also passed along to Saipan. The United States Navy was well aware of the dangers of typhoons in the Pacific, but despite advancements in weather forecasting developed since the First World War, their ability to track and accurately predict inclement weather was still in its infancy. Forecasters could use historic weather patterns to inform their predictions, but by this point their surest tool was still the age-old practice of observing current weather conditions and using these observations to predict what was coming. Since this particular typhoon was so compact, this practice made it all the more difficult to anticipate what was to come. While conditions rapidly worsened on the morning of December 17th, making replenishment operations exceedingly difficult, there was still no obvious sign that a typhoon was approaching the fleet. The weather forecasters on board the fleet's carriers and battleships continued to misjudge the situation. By midday, while the fleet was still unaware that things were about to get much worse, it was clear that refueling was impossible, and any attempt to continue put the ships of the fleet at risk of dangerous collisions. At 12:51, Admiral Halsey gave the order to pause refueling for the day and resume on the 18th. He also ordered that ships that were not able to refuel should ballast down with seawater. But several ships delayed following this order in hopes that they would soon get a brief window of time to refuel. 3 destroyers, USS Spence, Hickox, and Maddox, were down to only around 10 to 15% of their fuel capacity, and there was serious concern that these ships had less than 24 hours before they fully depleted their fuel and ended up dead in the water. Given the conditions at the time, this would be an incredibly dire situation. So these destroyers delayed taking on seawater as ballast and remained with the oilers so they could immediately begin refueling as soon as any opportunity arose. While this seemed a necessity due to the situation, this decision would prove deadly. As the afternoon went on and the weather continued to worsen, Admiral Halsey repeatedly ordered the fleet sail in different directions in an attempt to avoid the storm. He was still blissfully unaware that they were sailing in the path of a massive typhoon, and his orders ended up putting a large portion of the fleet directly in the path of the storm. For a brief period, they sailed on the same path, heading straight ahead only a little bit faster, giving the false impression that conditions were slowly improving. But this of course wasn't the case. As the night went on, winds gained in strength, and the already heavy seas continued to grow, tossing even the massive Essex-class fleet carriers around like toys. While some weather forecasters in the fleet, including those stationed on Yorktown and Lexington, realized the fleet was directly in the path of a typhoon, the majority, relying on reports radioed in from hundreds of miles away and historic patterns, still presumed that this was just a typical bout of rough weather. By mid-afternoon, a report of the weather system observed by the Mariner flying boats was finally issued from Saipan. These warnings put the disturbance only a little more than 100 miles away from the fleet. But even with these dire reports, Halsey still believed that they were dealing with a large storm and not a typhoon. He was concerned that if they moved the fleet too much to avoid the weather, they would fall into the range of Japanese kamikaze pilots, which were a serious concern at the time. While leadership continued to downplay the situation, many of the experienced captains in the fleet who used the age-old technique of checking their barometers and paying attention to what was happening outside, knew exactly what was coming. Orders were given on numerous ships to prepare for heavy weather. Planes were strapped down, fuel was drained, ammunition was secured, hatches were closed, and lifelines were established. That evening, Halsey issued one last updated course, hoping to place the fleet outside of the storm sooner so refueling could commence first thing in the morning. Little did he know, this order once again placed the fleet directly in the path of the typhoon, which was quickly barreling down on them. By midnight, barometers were plunging, a telltale sign that things were about to get bad. Meanwhile, operators of newly installed radar systems began observing a strange mass developing on their screens. While they didn't realize it at the time, they were some of the first to observe a storm system approaching on radar. Typhoon Cobra was heading straight for them. By dawn on the morning of December 18, 1944, the bulk of Task Force 38 was overtaken by the typhoon. The destroyers weren't the only part of the fleet poorly prepared for the hurricane-force winds and massive swells. The Independence-class light carriers were hastily designed just before the war to quickly add additional naval air power. They were constructed using converted light cruiser hulls, which created stability issues due to the top weight of a hangar, flight deck, and island. Initially, plans for these carriers were rejected due to their many limitations, but 9 were ordered shortly after the attacks on Pearl Harbor. The poor seakeeping abilities of these light carriers became abundantly clear that morning. At one point, USS Langley rolled a full 70 degrees before slowly righting herself. On USS Cowpens, 7 planes were washed overboard from the flight deck, and 1 plane in the hangar broke free, sparking a small fire that was quickly brought under control. A similar situation unfolded on USS San Jacinto, when a fighter plane broke free and destroyed 7 other planes in the hangar. But the situation was especially dire on USS Monterey. As the light cruiser rolled violently from side to side, the general quarters officer of the deck was thrown from a ladder and swept across the flight deck. He was washed over the side, but out of sheer luck, he landed on a small catwalk, narrowly avoiding almost certain death in the churning sea. This officer was future President Lieutenant Gerald R. Ford. Winds were so strong that the aircraft that were lashed to the deck, with their wings folded, were being picked up by the gale as if they were attempting to take off. Numerous planes broke free and washed over the side as the ship rolled up to 70 degrees. Below in the hangar, a fighter broke free and smashed into another plane, rupturing its fuel tank. While the tanks had been drained, there was enough fuel remaining to spill out and ignite as the planes smashed into the metal bulkheads. An explosion rocked the hangar, and flames soon spread throughout as nearly all the planes had broken free and were now sliding around in the inferno. Soon, smoke from the blaze filtered into the boiler and engine rooms, forcing the men to evacuate. Monterey soon lost steam power, crippling much of her essential equipment and firefighting capabilities. Then, the electric power shut off, plunging the burning ship into darkness. Steering and engines began to fail as the ship risked falling broadside to the massive waves. Facing an incredibly dire situation, Captain Stuart H. Ingersoll decided to divert all of the ship's remaining steam power to fighting the blaze. This left the ship essentially dead in the water. But Ingersoll realized that the more immediate danger was the risk of the ammunition on board igniting in the heat of the blaze. This proved wise, and gradually the fires were brought under control, and full power was eventually restored. 3 sailors were killed in the incident, and many more were injured. 18 planes were destroyed, and 16 were seriously damaged. Damage to USS Monterey was severe enough to require months of repairs, but she managed to survive the typhoon. Others in the fleet weren't so lucky. of the many destroyers in Task Force 38 that found themselves critically low on fuel, USS Spence's situation was among the most dire. Down to only about 15% of her fuel capacity, the Fletcher-class destroyer made a desperate attempt to refuel from Battleship New Jersey on the 17th. When this proved unsuccessful, she was ordered to remain near the oiler group and refuel as soon as an opportunity presented itself. Now, as the storm threw about the small destroyer, her captain finally ordered water ballasting to try and stabilize the ship, but it was too late. As waves careened over the vessel, water poured into her ventilators. On the bridge, pieces of equipment failed one by one. The rolling was so violent it felt like the floor was collapsing beneath them with each plunge into a trough. Then her distribution board failed, and her rudder jammed hard right. She listed dangerously to port. The lights cut out as her men waited for their ship to right herself. Her pumps stopped functioning, and she jerked further to port. This time, she didn't recover. USS Spence rolled onto her side, and she soon slipped beneath the waves only a few minutes after noon. 317 crew members were lost. Only 23 survived. She was the first ship to sink, but she wouldn't be the last. The Farragut-class destroyer USS Aylwin wasn't faring much better. One of the first to fall into distress, water poured into the ship through a broken hatch on her weather deck, shorting out her generators. The ship was plunged into darkness before the first light of dawn, and her steering controls were crippled. Captain William K. Rogers ordered his quartermaster to head for the ship's aft manual steering gear, while he attempted to regain control through various engine thrust combinations. Fire room personnel were forced to work in 10-minute shifts as temperatures in her engine room reached 180 degrees. Through their incredible efforts, power was restored just before dawn. Captain Rogers could barely control his ship as she pitched violently. At 9:35, they narrowly avoided collision with another ship that couldn't be identified in the low visibility. Coming off a shift in the sweltering boiler room, Engineering Officer Lieutenant E.R. Rendell and Machinist Mate T. Sarinsky stripped off their life jackets and collapsed as they emerged on deck. The two men were quickly swept overboard. Attempts were made to throw them a lifeline, but the two exhausted men almost immediately disappeared in the boiling sea. At 11 a.m., as she passed near the eye wall of the Typhoon, the Aylwin was hit by a wall of water that sent her into a 70-degree list to port. She remained listing for 20 minutes before very slowly righting herself. Incredibly, through the determination of her crew and a healthy portion of luck, the Aylwin suffered serious damage, but she managed to survive. Not far away, another Farragut-class destroyer, USS Dewey, was facing a similarly dire situation as she was pushed into an increasingly severe list. She was only saved when her quick-thinking crew jettisoned topside weight and reballasted her with seawater. The storm also ripped off her funnel, which reduced her sail area, helping stabilize the damaged ship. Dewey would survive the storm, but the vulnerabilities of the older Farragut-class destroyers were dangerously clear. On the morning of December 18, 1944, most of Task Force 38 was fighting through the heart of Typhoon Cobra. The fleet was still under orders to keep formation and sail south in an attempt to outrun the storm. This put the ships perpendicular to the storm's path, making them all the more vulnerable. If they broke formation, they risked colliding with another ship, and most attempted to stay on course. But as the storm overtook them, this was increasingly difficult, and by noon, much of the fleet was just fighting for survival. The Farragut-class destroyer USS Hull was one of many that found herself in an increasingly desperate situation. While her fuel was at 70%, she needed every last bit of ballast to fight through the storm. The older destroyer had over 500 tons of extra weapons and equipment added over the course of her career, making her dangerously top-heavy. The empty 30% of her fuel tanks had to be ballasted with seawater to give her a fighting chance, but this was not done in time. As winds reached over 100 knots at 11 a.m., Hull was rolling 50 degrees. As the storm intensified, she reached 70 degrees. Inside, her crew struggled mightily to traverse the nearly overturned ship, as walls, floors, and ceilings seemed to spin around them. She survived a number of harrowing rolls, but at around noon, as she once again heaved to the side, the now 110-knot winds pinned her down. Soon, her funnel dipped into the churning sea, and water poured in, dooming the destroyer. She capsized and sank only a few minutes after noon, claiming the lives of 202 crew members. Only 62 survived. Yet another Farragut-class destroyer, USS Monaghan, found herself in a similarly dire situation. She had about 76% of her fuel, but she still needed full tanks to ride out the storm. They attempted to ballast down with seawater, but her valves stuck and she ran out of time. At 11:30, after rolling heavily and taking on water, she lost electric power and her steering engines failed. Monaghan had an incredible career, earning 12 battle stars. The destroyer sank a Japanese midget submarine during the attack on Pearl Harbor. She took part in the Battle of Midway and drove a Japanese submarine into the rocks in the Aleutians. Now, dead in the water, she was thrown around violently until she finally rolled over and sank just before noon. 256 of her crew were lost. Only 6 survived. At 1:14 p.m., when the worst of the typhoon had already moved over the fleet, Admiral Halsey finally issued a typhoon warning. This was after the storm took down 3 destroyers, smashed or washed overboard 146 planes, and damaged 27 ships, 11 requiring major repairs that removed them from action. The Japanese would have been thrilled to inflict such damage. By early evening on the 18th, the destroyer escort USS Tabberer was in a sorry state, having just narrowly survived. After rolling more than 60 degrees, both her foremast and radio antennas had broken away. As they began repairing the significant damage, the destroyer came across a survivor from USS Hull, struggling for life in the water. After rescuing the man and learning that a ship had been lost, Lieutenant Commander Henry L. Plage commenced a box search. That evening, Admiral Halsey ordered his bruised fleet to regroup in Ulithi. He would not learn of the fleet's losses until the next day. Plage either didn't receive or possibly ignored these repeated orders over the next 51 hours, as his crew picked up 55 survivors from the water, including 41 from Hull and 14 from Spence. Crewmen fired rifles into the water to drive away sharks, as swimmers from Hull dragged the survivors to the ship using nets and life rings. Lieutenant Commander Plage was awarded a Legion of Merit, and Tabberer received a Navy Unit Commendation for their heroic actions. They were finally relieved by 2 additional destroyers that picked up a few more men. By the 22nd, the entire fleet was finally sent to search for survivors. But by this point, rescue efforts were mostly futile. In total, 93 were rescued from the water, having either been on a ship that sank or were washed overboard. More than half were rescued by Tabberer. 790 men were lost in the storm. The incredible damage and loss of life prompted a court of inquiry at Ulithi on December 26, 1944. Vice Admiral John Hoover presided over the inquiry, and Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz was in attendance. They placed responsibility for the losses and damage on Admiral Halsey, but they didn't go so far as to ascribe negligence, stating that Halsey's mistakes were errors in judgment committed under the stress of war operations and stemming from a commendable desire to meet military requirements. While they found that his attempts to refuel the fleet at the particular time and place was a mistake, they acknowledged that he had no way of knowing where the eye of the typhoon was headed at the time. A number of captains and weather forecasters on other ships were certain that they were dealing with the typhoon by midday on the 17th, and nearly all were certain by that evening. But a few holdouts on Halsey's flagship USS New Jersey were adamant that they were just dealing with a storm, and these were the predictions Halsey went with. It's clear now that these forecasters relied too heavily on historic patterns and reports radioed in from hundreds of miles away, when the best way to assess the situation would have been to rely more heavily on observations made on the scene. While the inquiry was somewhat forgiving, Halsey's orders to maintain formation, even well into the storm, almost certainly put many of his ships in a much more vulnerable position. And while he had no way of knowing that such a violent storm was imminent, he definitely ignored many signs that trouble was brewing in order to keep up the fleet's mission of providing air support in Luzon. It's easy in retrospect to criticize, but it seems that the tunnel vision of war prevented Halsey from adequately preparing for an adversary mightier than the whole of every navy on Earth, the natural fury of the sea. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, help the channel grow by liking, commenting, and subscribing. Don't forget to check out Call of War, a free online PvP strategy game that takes place during World War II. Choose your strategy, engage in epic battles, and take over the world. Get 13,000 gold and 1 month of a premium subscription for free. Click the link in the description below, choose your country, and fight your way to victory. I'd like to give a special shout out to my lovely supporters on Patreon and my channel members. They know a typhoon when they see it. Alright crew, that's all I've got. Until the next one, be nice to people.